All right, diving into our first game here, Magnus Carlsen is playing as white, and he tries to throw his opponent Hans Niemann off guard on move 1 with the move c4, the English opening. Now, this move is very playable, but obviously not as popular as d4 or e4 on move 1. Now, Hans Niemann, knight to f6. Here, Magnus goes knight to f3, clamping down on the e5 square. Hans Niemann had the option of going e5 immediately on move 1, but now e5 is permanently blocked as that knight does control the square. Now here Hans goes e6, potentially heading for a Queen's Gambit decline sort of structure, and here Magnus goes g3, the Catalan style move. So now Magnus Carlsen, his plan is going to be bishop g2, and we'll have to see if he does go d4 later in the game, transposing to a Catalan structure, or if he delays that move even permanently. Now here Hans Niemann d5, very classical move. Now Magnus goes bishop g2, bishop e7 for Hans Niemann, and both sides castle. Now this is the critical position of this opening. Here Hans Niemann is going to take on c4 next if Magnus Carlsen doesn't do anything else. So here Magnus, what is he going to do? Is he going to go d4, transposing back to a Catalan, or perhaps b3 or something else? Well, in the game here, Magnus goes for the move d3. This is a very trendy option right now. There are a lot of grandmasters playing in this style. So what's the idea? Well, first of all, that pawn on the c4 square is now defended by the pawn on the d3 square. Beyond that, white may want to go perhaps c takes d5 or even e4, breaking in the center with the e-pawn. So white here has a lot of flexibility, a lot of different options. Now here, Hans Niemann, the main move is going to be c5, but instead he throws a little bit of a curveball at Magnus Carlsen. He goes a5, expanding on the queen side. Now this is not the best move here. It doesn't fight for the center of the board quite as well as c5. However, it is very playable, and in the Catalan, black often goes a5, getting space on the queen side, so it's an interesting idea. Now Magnus Carlsen, knight to c3, a good move, developing the knight. And here black's best option is going to be d4, getting space in the center, and if white goes knight b5, then black can always go bishop c5, defending that new pawn on the d4 square. Now, instead of that, here Hans Niemann goes c6. This move is in the spirit of the semi-Slav defense, where black gets that pawn triangle in the middle of the board. However, here it wasn't necessarily the best idea. Overall, this move is a little bit slow, and now Magnus can strike in the center with the move e4, and that is exactly what he does in the game. Now here, Magnus is threatening e5 if black does nothing. From there, Magnus would be getting space on the king side, and he could potentially start a kingside attack in the spirit of the King's Indian attack opening. Now, Hans Niemann, what should he be doing about this threat of e5? Well, in the game, he basically ignores it with move knight to a6. Kind of a curious looking move. Obviously, c6 not available for the knight, so the knight has to go there. But now Magnus just jumps in with the e5 pawn, e5 on the board. Black is forced to go knight d7. And here Magnus Carlsen already has a very significant advantage out of the opening. This is sort of a good version of a King's Indian attack or a red-eye opening for white. I mean, it's very playable for black in general, but here these moves a5, knight a6, and c6 don't really make a lot of sense in this structure. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen starts to gain space on the king side with the move h4, a very good move. Magnus may be threatening h5 in the future, maybe even h6. And beyond that, this move also sets up the idea of knight to g5. From there, white can go queen to h5, threatening checkmate on the h7 square. So overall, h4, a very good multi-purpose move by Magnus Carlsen. Now here, Hans Niemann, he continues to go astray. In the game, he goes b6. His idea, perhaps, is to go bishop b7, but overall, this is very, very slow. Instead, here, Hans Niemann simply had to go knight to c7, setting up b5 ideas, expanding on the queen side. However, after b6, his setup is just not geared towards getting counterplay on the queen side where he has the space advantage. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen continues rook to e1, defending the pawn on the e5 square, a very good move. Now knight to g5 is a possibility as that pawn on e5 would not be hanging. Now here, Hans Niemann, bishop b7, continuing his plan, but that bishop on the b7 square is doing literally nothing in this position. It's biting on granite on d5. Perhaps Hans wants to go c5 next. Maybe that's his idea. But here, Magnus Carlsen pretty much shuts that idea down permanently. He takes on d5, c takes d5, black takes back, and then the key move d4 from Magnus Carlsen, locking in the structure in the center of the board. And here, that bishop on b7, again, is just permanently weak. Overall, Hans would likely want to have that bishop on a6 instead of b7, but now that'd be a waste of a tempo, and overall, Hans Niemann's position is just looking awful right here. Now in the game, Hans does go bishop c6, perhaps trying to go b5 next. And here Magnus shows his idea, knight g5, the key move we've been talking about. Now Magnus is ready to go queen to h5, setting up checkmating ideas on the h7 square, and that is what happens. Here Hans, b5, finally getting something going on the queen side, but Magnus jumps in with the queen to h5, threatening checkmate in one move. Obviously, Hans Niemann has to do something about this threat right here. So what are Hans Niemann's options here to defend against queen takes h7? Well, one idea is h6, that does block the check. However, here, white can simply go knight to h3, and now there are all sorts of sacrificial ideas based on bishop takes h6. That would be an absolute disaster for black. Instead, in the game, Hans Niemann perhaps plays the better idea, bishop takes g5, knocking off that knight permanently. However, to do that, he did have to give up the key dark squared bishop, and now after bishop takes g5, white's bishop is an absolute monster on the dark squares. Alright, now the queen on d8 is under attack. What should Hans do? In the game, he goes queen to e8, a perfectly reasonable move. But now Magnus, he increases the pressure with the move queen to g4. Now the threat is either bishop to f6, or even better, bishop h6. And obviously the pawn on the g7 square will be pinned. And that means Hans Niemann may be at risk of losing his rook, or perhaps even worse, getting checkmated again. Now in the game, Hans respects the threat. He goes king to h8. Again, if black ignores that, say rook b8 or any other waiting move, then bishop h6 is absolutely devastating, and that bishop cannot be taken because of the pin on the king. Now heading back to the game, king h8 on the board from Hans Niemann. Now rook a c1, Magnus Carlsen setting up threats against that bishop on the c6 square. And here Hans Niemann makes yet another key mistake, knight b6. Now his idea perhaps is to go knight c4 at some point, but this knight is now further away from the defense of the king, and that is going to be a huge problem for him. Now Magnus, how should he continue the attack? Well, it's going to be hard to win the game with just the queen and the bishop trying to checkmate black. So with that in mind, here Magnus finds a really good way to reroute the knight on the c3 square all the way over to the king side on the h5 square. Here's how he does it. Knight e2. Now Hans Niemann jumps in with his knight to the b4 square, knight b4 on the board, then knight to f4. Black takes on a2, then knight to h5. Magnus Carlsen simply going knight e2, knight f4, knight h5, and now, believe it or not, the threat is knight to f6. And if the knight plumps there, if black ever takes it on f6, then white can recapture with the bishop with check, and again, that would be effectively game over. So Hans here, rook g8, tried to defend against the threat, but Magnus Carlsen jumps in with the knight anyway, knight to f6 on the board. Now, here's the problem. If you take the knight, you pretty much lose on the spot. For example, g takes f6 is met by bishop takes f6, then the only way to stop the checkmate is rook g7, but then queen takes g7 is going to be checkmate. Now, what else can black do besides that? Well, the best move according to the engine is knight takes c1, but again, that doesn't deal with these threats on the queen. Magnus can literally win the queen if he wants to. In the game, Hans Niemann does go queen f8, getting the queen out of the attack of the knight, but here Magnus, queen to h5. Again, leaving the knight on pre, black can take it if he wants to, and that is what happens in the game. G takes f6. Here Magnus goes bishop takes f6. Now, of course, you have to block the check. You have the rook or the queen. In the game, Hans Niemann does block the check with the rook, the best move. But here, Magnus Carlsen, he doesn't even have to capture the rook right away. Instead, he goes rook takes c6, capturing the bishop on the c6 square, threatening rook takes b6. And here, Hans Niemann plays one last move, knight to c4, but in this position, he's running out of time, and he literally resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen with 3 seconds left on his clock. Wow, very impressive game by Magnus Carlsen, but this next game is even crazier.